Well, my name is Ben Rule. I am the pastor of a church in Alton, New Hampshire, a town of about 5,000, right in the middle of the state of New Hampshire, and it's an honor to be here today with all of you. I'm a part of the Small Town Summits leadership team, and we have been praying for today. We've been excited for today, and so our prayer is that today you would go home excited and about the work God has called you to do in the places He has called you to do it. I want to tell you a quick story. A couple years ago, I was driving across Massachusetts, and I could have taken the turnpike, but I didn't have to get anywhere in a hurry, so I decided to take the Mohawk Trail. Yeah. I'd never been out that way before, and I'm not from New England originally, so I wanted to see that part of the state, and I was driving through that part of the state, just amazed by the beauty of that road. You know if you've taken it, specifically in the fall. But as I was driving down that road and I was going through these small towns, really these nameless small towns, I came to one where I saw a building that really was left, it looked abandoned. And in the window of that building, somebody had taken blue painter's tape and had written a message for everybody driving through the town. And all it said was, "This place matters." And I just thought about what was going on in that person's heart when they wrote that. Because they most likely live in that town. And every single day they watch cars drive through their town, just seeing the beauty, but missing the fact that the places that they're driving through matter. They were writing that sign for people like me who didn't care about that town. I was just cared about the beauty. And so what I was thinking about when I saw that sign was simply that this place matters to the people who live here. This place matters to the people doing ministry here. And this place matters to God. And that is right at the heart of the message that we're going to hear from Brad Roth as he comes up here to speak. Because the fact that God cares about the small places is central to the award-winning book that he wrote a number of years ago, God's Country. Brad Roth serves as a pastor at Westside Mennonite Church in Moundridge, Kansas. He grew up baling hay, tending sheep, shearing Christmas trees in central Illinois. He's a graduate of Augustana College, Harvard Divinity School, and the Anabaptist Mennonite Biblical Seminary. That is a long name. I've never heard of that school. Most importantly, he is the husband to Lisi, the father of 2 sons, and a child of God, passionate about living out God's love in the small places. Will you join me in welcoming Brad Roth?
Well, hello, East Coast. Greetings from No Coast. So I hail from Kansas, that big sky, tornado-dodging, amber waves of grain state on the Great Plains, emphasis on great. And I'm Brad Roth, and I actually have to update my bio because I am now the father of 3 sons. This is kind of where I'm at. We've got a 14-year-old, an 11-year-old, and a 7-week-old, so it's been a bit of an adjustment, but yeah. But so, the other day I'm like doing one of these, right? Like kind of walking around like, who's a good baby, right? And then from downstairs, I hear this music. My other sons are downstairs, and I hear this dun 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 dun, and I'm like dun dun dun. I go downstairs, and they're lifting weights to the Rocky theme song. So this is where I'm at. It's like Rockabye Baby upstairs and Rocky theme song downstairs, but it's awesome. Well, I serve as the pastor of the Westside Mennonite Church in Moundridge, Kansas, which is a community of about 1,800 people, and that's in central Kansas. Now, in the 1870s, folks who were mostly German-speaking Mennonites, you can go ahead and flip to the first slide. They were German-speaking Mennonites from the colonies in Russia, and they started getting off the train in central Kansas on the plains, and they kind of took a look around at the tall grass prairie, and they said, this looks a lot like where we came from, let's make it home. And they set up schools, they set up farmsteads and churches and townships, They got to work planting their prized turkey red wheat. Now, they weren't the first people who lived in the area. The U.S. Army had displaced and exterminated native peoples, and other European pioneers had been settling the Kansas and Nebraska territories or passing through on the Oregon and Santa Fe trails for a couple of decades. And to provision these people, steamboats plied the Missouri River, ferrying goods that then kind of fanned out by wagon train and railroad to find their way into small-town general stores. But traveling up the Missouri River was dangerous. As the riverbanks eroded, stumps left by earlier rounds of tree-cutting pioneers would fall into the water. They would get pointed downstream by the current and become these perfectly shaped riverboat hazards. Now, one of the steamboats that was plying the Missouri was called the Arabia, and it was heading up the Missouri toward the city of Omaha, this little city, in September 5th, 1856, when it hit a tree snag, right? One of these trees pointing downstream. And the Arabia quickly took on water and sank, and all the passenger and the crew survived, but 200 tons of cargo, including silk from China, dishes from England, perfume from France, and beads from Czechoslovakia, as well as thousands of shoes, guns, and farming implements were lost. There were also some barrels of whiskey, which were rumored to have floated downstream, but if they were found, no one is saying. Now, in the late 1980s, several hardworking and inventive families tracked down the location of the steamboat Arabia, and they were successful. They found it, and they dug it up, and they went on to build this really wonderful museum in Kansas City. And part of the challenge for these families was finding and excavating the boat. Because although it went down in the Missouri, it was no longer underwater, but rather in a soybean field. See, the Missouri River has, or at least used to have before the Army Corps of Engineers worked on it, this kind of meandering course. But these guys figured it out. They took out a massive loan for equipment and workers, and they dug up the steamboat Arabia and its cache of goods, and it's really this time capsule from 1856. And I wonder if the steamboat Arabia can be something of a parable for the rural church, with its changing local geography, its hint of surprising rural ferment and dangers that must be navigated. But also, when I look at the steamboat Arabia, I especially see the drive to go out to the most remote places. The steamboat Arabia was carrying goods destined for what was supposed to be the middle of nowhere. And that drive to go to the middle of nowhere was economic. Maybe it was even nationalistic, which, coming from a commitment to manifest destiny. But it makes me think about the church, which happens to often be depicted as a boat in ancient iconography, braving the waters and the frontier and the great open spaces away from the population centers to find its way out to the places where there is plenty of God, but fewer of people. So I want to think with you about this vision of the church going out to the remotest places. And I want to think about why we go and what we do when we get there. Because I'm convinced that the very nature of God as we see him in Jesus Christ is what compels us, drives us, urges us to go out as the church to the smallest, most out of the way, God bless them, podunk places. I think we're called to paddle upstream. Now, the first part of this is easy. God's extravagant, self-emptying love is what sends us out. It's in the very nature of God's love to go to the lost and the least, to push outward towards the ends of the earth, and rural communities are often the preeminent ends. God's love is cruciform, and you see this in Jesus, who, as Paul teaches in that wonderful hymn in Philippians chapter 2, took the form of a slave, being born in human likeness and being found in human form. He humbled himself and became obedient unto death, even death on the cross. Therefore, God also highly exalted him and gave the name that is above every name, so that at the name of Jesus, every knee should bend in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. And Jesus embodied, not he demonstrated, but he also embodied this mission and ministry to the edges. He befriended sinners and tax collectors. He trafficked in grace among adulterers and prostitutes. He ate with Pharisees. And you see Jesus sending out his students in the same kind of ministry, first the 12 who went out to proclaim the good news and cure the sick, raise the dead, cleanse the lepers, cast out demons, but then also the 72 who hit the road with no money or traveler's bag or an extra pair of sandals. Jesus' teaching pointed to a mission to the edges. And one place that we see this is in the feeding of the 5,000. There's this moment where he's with his disciples, and there's this huge crowd of people around him. And the Gospels tell us that it was 5,000 men plus women and children. And the disciples, they want Jesus to send them away, right, so they can get something to eat. But Jesus doesn't take their advice. And if you look at the various gospel accounts, you find him doing several things. The first is that he tells the disciples, you give them something to eat. And I've always kind of taken that as a challenge to the disciples' faith, as in he was setting them up to really place their faith in him. You give them something to eat, they can't, so they turn to Jesus and, hey, look, he can, right? And that's part of what the story is. But at that moment, in the feeding of the 5,000, where the disciples are poised between Jesus and these hungry people, it's also this moment of empowering. And Jesus is telling them that they have what they need to feed these people because he gives them what they need. And I think it's striking that when he receives the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, that the Greek verbs in the Gospels are reminiscent of the words of the Lord's Supper. So, yeah, the second piece of this, right, is take, bless, break, and give. And the second piece of this, and I think this is really key, is that after all the people are fed, they took up 12 baskets full of the broken pieces and of the fish. And that strikes me as an intriguing detail, because it would have been very easy to imagine this story ending on the multiplication, but it doesn't. The story ends on the gathering. And the number of baskets, 12, is significant because the number 12 is a number that represents the whole people of God throughout the scriptures, right? So 12 tribes and 12 disciples in the cubed city of Revelation that is measured in multiples of 12. And in the feeding of the 4,000 in chapter 8, there are 7 baskets that are full. 7 is the number of perfection, probably also points to the 7 deacons in Acts chapter 6. And if you think about the Didache, that first century church document, it has this brief communion order, this little hint of a liturgy. And it says this: as this piece of bread was scattered over the hills and then was brought together and made one, so that your church be brought together from the ends of the earth into your kingdom. At this fusional moment, that is the celebration of the Lord's Supper, the body of Christ, that is the bread, forms the body of Christ, that is the gathered people. And that involves both the empowering to be the body and the ingathering of all the parts of the body. And in that gathering up of all the fragments so that none may be lost, I think we get a glimpse of Jesus' vision for the church. It's a church that goes to all places. There's a way in which the bread in the story, like in the Didache, represents the whole church. And Jesus has a heart for all of those tiny fragments, all of those tiny churches, and all of those tiny places. And he doesn't want any of them to be lost or forgotten. They're an authentic and vital part of the church universal. Gather them in, that none may be lost. And what we're talking about is the ancient theological quality of Catholicity, which is the way that the church is kataholos or katholos, from the whole, gathered from all places and sent to all places. This is what we claim to profess when we recite the Nicene and the Apostles' Creed. We believe in one holy Catholic and apostolic church. It's Catholic with a little c. The church at the ends of the earth. The church gathered in from all the tiniest fragments. Let none be lost. But at the heart of this Catholicity is what underlies all thinking about who God is and what God calls us to do, and that's love. Now, my wife is from Peru. She spent some of her childhood in this small town of Marcona, which is down the coast from Lima. Lima is a mega city of like 9 to 12 million people, but most of her family is in Lima. I've kind of been like easing her into rural over our 18 years of marriage. But once when she was a little girl, her family was traveling up the coast, going to Marcona or Lima or something. They're in this little Volkswagen Bug, And they came across a place where the road was washed out, and there was this kind of team of guys who were there, and for a fee, they were walking cars through this washed out road, right? They'd help them pick the path so that they could get from the good part to the other good part, not get washed away. And there was one part where they would actually, it's like this is the kind of stuff that can happen with the Volkswagen Bug. Like, they would come and grab the edge of the car and just give it a little tiny lift to get over a little soft spot, right? That's what they proposed. We'll get you through. But my wife's dad was like, how much are you asking? He's like, no way, right? We're just doing it. Like, he's that kind of guy. We're just going through. And so he didn't want to pay up because it was an exorbitant sum. So he just starts driving through, right? And this white knuckle drive through the washed out road. And they're doing fine at first, but then the current kind of catches the car and it starts to shift a little bit. And so he rolls down his window because he can't go. His tires are spinning. He rolls down his window and he yells at the guys, hey, come and help us out. Get over here and help us out. And the guys came running and splashing through the water, and they come up and they go, well, how much? How much are you going to pay us to help you out now? He goes, how much? Well, I'll tell you how much. Do it for the love of God. And apparently that convinced them because they helped him get the rest of the way through, and he did pay him a little something at the end. But why do we go to the smallest places? We'll do it for the love of God. And why do we respond to God's call to go to the smallest places? For the love of God. And why does God send the church to those places? It's for his abundant, overflowing love. And so Catholicity is about the love of God. Love for all people, but also for all places. I love that, what Ben was saying. This place matters. That's why we do it. The church has got to be in rural communities. And what's more, I think that the rural church is a sign to the global church of God's love expressed in Catholicity. The very existence of the rural church keeps reminding the global church that whatever may be going on with population trends, whatever economic development might be taking place, wherever Amazon decides to locate or not locate their headquarters, the church will always have as its mission to go to the ends of the earth. And this might not seem like much to you, right? We go to rural places for the love of God. Tell me something I don't know. But you see, it's in the nature of God to love all that he has made, all people, but also all places. And this means that the church is not being the church if it expects people to drive into worship in the city or the suburb. The church is not fully being the church if it isn't going everywhere there are people and loving those people in the concreteness of their context. The church can't abandon rural and still be the church. Now, this is a reality that is unique to the church. In recent years, one of the narratives that has dominated our society's perceptions of rural is the narrative of rural decline. And it's sort of hillbilly elegy on steroids, if you've read that book. The narrative of rural decline. It's the idea that rural places are falling apart like rusting pickup trucks. And there was this article in the New York Times a couple of months back that claimed that vast swaths of the Great Plains were being farmed by satellite-linked harvesters that were driven by remote control. In other words, the Midwest and the Great Plains, they're not just flyover territory. Maybe you've heard of that. They're not just flyover territory, they're like Mars, right? They're uninhabitable. You got to go there in drones, right? I would really like to see harvest happen with no people, by the way, but that would be interesting. But the question that arises for economists out of this narrative of rural decline is, how do we best help rural people and rural communities? And that's a complicated question with complicated responses. But one response has been to simply say that rural people just need to move away to places that have more jobs. And indeed, a lot of folks have been doing just that without any recommendation from government agencies. They've voted with their feet in places like Jewell County, Kansas, along the lightly populated Kansas-Nebraska border, which lost half of its population between 1970 and the early 2000s. And while economists might craft policies that encourage people to simply move elsewhere where there's more work, that won't fit for the church. You see, because of God's love, there is no place the church is not called to, and there is no place that is not worthy of our best and most creative leadership. That's what we're talking about when we talk about Catholicity. The church is called to communities of all sorts, not least rural communities. But what do we do when we get there? Well, I think we want to practice discipleship in place. And discipleship in place means paying attention to the unique contours of place, to its local geography and local culture. It's taking seriously the words of Eugene Peterson that pastoral work is geographical as much as it is theological. This means taking the time to do our contextual theology, but it's more than that. Discipleship in place means that the way we do church will have terroir. And I know it's like all downhill from here, right, if I start using French wine terms, but I'm not even into wine, right? It's evangelical seminary, but take it as a communion metaphor, right? Terroir. I like this word, right? And terroir for wine is the way that the place where the grapes are grown imparts a distinctive character to the wine. And I think there's something like that going on with the church. We need to discover how the church lives the gospel on the ground through love of place and love of people. We need to be asking the question, what is the terroir of our church in small town Maine or Vermont or Massachusetts? And how is that different from rural Kansas? And how does our church have a terroir that's distinctive from a downtown Boston church? And I think that this sense of the distinctiveness of church in place inflects how we lead and minister in a number of ways. And I want to talk about two of them. One, we pay attention, and two, we befriend. Now, we first have to learn how to pay attention. Oh, sorry, go back two, please. We first have to learn how to pay attention. Go one forward, please. And I'm kind of seeing that this is now like our leitmotif of our time together, right? We have to see our rural communities. We need to have some understanding of the promise and the challenges and what people are facing in the places that we're ministering. This means, first off, noticing what our context is not. For instance, rural communities are not all farmers, right? You know this, right? The statistic is that 8% of people in rural communities nationwide are farmers, so not everybody's a farmer. And then we also have to notice what the culture is, or what are the overlapping cultures of our community? How do people in your area see the world? What do they value? What do they celebrate? And I get that line of what do they celebrate from the principal of the Garden City, Kansas school district. Garden City is a small city. It's like 20,000 people in western Kansas. Western Kansas has a great tradition of ranching. So they have a huge meatpacking plant there. And that has brought a lot of refugees and immigrant workers to the area. So here's Garden City, Kansas, 20,000 people, and they have 22 languages spoken in the school district, right? So the principal says, we got to find common ground. What do other people celebrate? We want to celebrate that too. Or I talked to a church planter in Ephraim, Utah. And who are there a lot of in Ephraim, Utah? Or in Utah in general, right? Yeah, Mormons, right? So Ephraim, Utah, and he said, look, you got to come in and you have to find things to appreciate. He says, I came in as a house painter, and this was not a front for him. He really was a house painter. It's how he paid the bills, right? And so he'd be in people's houses painting the walls, and then he'd strike up a conversation with them, and then he'd invite them to the Bible study in his house. And the way he did this, the Bible study kind of organically became this church, and it almost happened by surprise. Somebody one day in the Bible study said, aren't we a church now? He said, yeah, I guess we are. And then he said, well, what do you think we should name it, right? And so it became this church. And he said, you have to go in and value the structure of the community, value the family religious systems. He's like, you got to affirm Mormon family values. There's a lot to have trouble with as far as Mormon theology, but like the family values, find something that you affirm, right? And then start with that. So ask that question, what's the culture, right? Does your area perceive itself to be growing or declining or holding steady? And I think in rural areas in particular, we have to be able to speak to marginality and loss. And the key disciplines for doing all this are noticing and valuing. I liked Steve's line this morning that you cannot serve what you don't see, right? And so we got to learn to see our communities, give our communities the national geographic treatment. And I think this is maybe especially important in rural areas areas in light of the way that rural areas are often undervalued, right? And officially so across the Midwest and the Great Plains. So this map is called the Natural Amenities Index, and on that map you want to be dark green. And what they have done, the USDA, and I try to imagine this, right? But the USDA goes through and ranks every county in the United States, and if you have high mountains, you get like a 12 for that, and then if you have open water, you get like a 10 for that, and so they rank it, and then they do the math. And you'll notice that there's this big trough of orange and yellow across the center of the country, like a lot of places that I really love. You guys are doing all right in New England, most of New England, I guess, but you really want to be apparently in Colorado or California or Florida. But you can actually come out negative on this scale, right? And so I did not create this, but you can come out negative. The counties that I have lived in have been negative on this scale, right? So, I think we got to learn to see, right? We got to learn to see the beauty that is there. And this requires a paradigm shift in our thinking, because we're accustomed to see need as pastors and as leaders in the church. Do we see beauty? Both the natural beauty and then also the moral beauty, right? Do we treasure people and place? And I think about Paul in Acts chapter 17, right? He shows up on the Areopagus in Athens, on Mars Hill, and he sees all of these idols. And Luke tells us that he takes a look around, and he sees all these idols, and he is very distressed. But then when the moment comes for Paul to strike up a conversation with some of the philosophers who are there, he doesn't say, I sure hate your idols. He says, I see that you are very religious, right? And then he talks about Jesus. Right, so he notices something good, and he starts from there. And so in this noticing, it's not just strategic, it's an act of love. So first we notice, and the second thing that we do is befriend. And I think this begins with befriending individuals, and this means just building relationships. It's really that simple, and I'm not telling anything you don't know, but it's building relationships. My wife and I, we try to watch, it's a small town, we watch for moving trucks, right? And if we can, we go and connect those folks. And so one time my wife spotted a moving truck, and we showed up at their front door with a plate of cookies and like a Westside postcard taped to the bottom of that plate of cookies. And the folks were super friendly. They invited us in, and we sat down, and we're talking about life. And all of a sudden, the lady of the family, she looks up and goes, I hope you didn't just come here to invite us to your church. And I was like, busted, but... And I sort of was busted. But at the same time, we did want to get to know them. And those folks have showed up in our church from time to time, but more important has been the way that we have built a relationship with them over the last couple of years. My wife was teaching their daughter Spanish, and we just connect to them, right, in various ways. And she'll call up and have a question about spiritual life, and then kind of that'll be what it is, right? But it's just this relationship building. And friendship, I think, helps us value people and value the ins and outs of rural community. Because in rural communities, you've probably figured this out, people are interrelated. Before we moved to small town Kansas, I had never heard of double first cousins, right? So two sisters marry two brothers. Kids are double first cousins, right? It's all good. But we got to figure that out, right? We got to learn to fit into the structure of relationships. And I think rural communities put a special premium on knowing and being known. And I think we have to take the time to be with people, to build that trust. Now, in small town and rural environments, our challenge is also our opportunity. Because rural communities are often defined by relationships, by being known and knowable. And this means that they have a structure. And structure and relationships are both this challenge and opportunity. So a structure is the ins and the outs of the community, right? How does power flow in your community? What are the various cultures of your community? Who will associate with who or won't? And you get people, you see this, because structure goes back into time, right? You see people saying things like, oh, you live in the old Golly house, right? Or whatever that is. And the old Crable house, right? And I talked to a pastor who kind of lovingly chided his congregation. He's like, folks can name who lived in the house 50 years ago, but they can't name who lives there now. It's the Martinez's now, right? So And the other piece of this, it's structure, but it's also relationships. And a guy named Ferdinand Tönnies in the 19th century, he's a German sociologist, he defined rural communities as Gemeinschaft. And it's a little bit simplistic, but it does kind of get at something that's true, right? That a Gemeinschaft is a community that is structured and regulated by trust, relationships, and social boundaries. And again, it's only kind of a thumbnail sketch of rural, right? Because obviously there's contracts and formal roles and all that in rural communities too. It's an oversimplification. But I think it does get at the reality that relationships loom large in rural communities. And trust looms large in rural communities, right? So in my town, like you go to the lumber yard, we have one. You go to the lumber yard and you pick up a 2x4 and you throw it in your pickup truck and you walk in and you say, I got a 2x4, and you walk back out, right? Like they just put it on your tab. What does it mean when you live in a community like that? And I think part of what it means is that pastors and leaders have to earn trust and have to find their way into that structure of relationships. Now, a key question in this becomes, are you one of us, right? And I read about an activist named Micah White, and he's a progressive activist, and I'm not talking about his politics, just what he did, which I find fascinating. He's a progressive activist who said, we've got to stop trying just to win the presidential election. We got to put our philosophy to use at the grassroots level. And so what he did was move to the tiny town of Nehalem, Oregon, population 285, and he ran for mayor, right? I mean, that's putting your life where your philosophy is, right? And so this counter movement turned up around town, signs that said, keep Nehalem, Nehalem, right? So for me, it's this question, are you one of us? I talked to Michael Gray. He's a pastor at a campus church of Cross Point Church, which is a big church in a small city. And when the president is in Hutchinson, Kansas, when the president mentioned that Hutchinson is a small town, I was surprised because I thought Hutchinson was a city, but 40,000 people, right? So Michael Gray is starting a campus church. They're kind of fanning out into these smaller communities. They've got this vision for that. And I talked to him and he said, we have learned to call the local campus a church and not a plant or a campus or a satellite. For us to do that does not give the impression of being in the community very long. So if they call it something else besides the church, they're like, oh, you're just going to leave. You're not one of us. This is one of the ways that relationships can kind of be a double-edged sword in rural communities, right? They cut both ways. So we can be really good at relating to people in our small rural communities, but sometimes there are also hidden relationships that keep people out of our congregations. It's the obvious one of like the ex-spouse of a divorced couple goes to your church, so the other one's never going to come, right? Or a business deal or a service that someone felt wasn't right, that person's never going to come to your congregation. And sometimes in our tight-knit churches, it can be hard to break in. But I think it can also be done well. I talked to an older gentleman who told me how he had connected with a couple of boys that their pastor had asked to drive to the youth group. And he built a relationship with these young boys. They were in high school. He's in his 70s. And he taught them how to drive. And they kind of got into this rhythm of every Sunday afternoon, he'd go by their house, pick them up, they'd drive through the countryside, and then they'd go to a fast food restaurant and sit and eat a burger or whatever and talk about life. And at first he really saw these kids as like, he was trying to guide them, right? They came from a little bit of a rough background. He wanted to help them make better decisions. They were his projects. And he was frustrated that it was not working out with them. But then he started to think about the relationship as friendship, and there wasn't this pressure to try to change them. And paradoxically, he felt like he started to make progress with them. He's just trying to be their friend, just relate to them. And he said this, it's crazy that they even like me. Right? He's 70, they're teens. And I said, no, it's not. You're their friend. The other piece that we need to do to live out discipleship in place, is to befriend the community. And it's not seeing our community as a project to be fixed, but as a place worthy of God's grace and goodness. And this is something that I had to learn along the way. The community that we served in Washington State was a little bit rough around the edges, and I would sometimes take this kind of perverse joy in showing it off. And, people would come to town, I'd be like, look at all the broken windows, right? I'd walk around town with the baby carriage and my trash grabber. I'm cleaning this place up, right? I'm fixing this place. But by God's grace and the kindness of the people that live there, we started to come around to another way of seeing our town. And in spite of ourselves, we started to love it. And we wept when we left. I'm convinced that friendship is the key image for rural ministry, especially in places that have a history of marginality and loss, which is a lot of our rural communities, but probably small churches in general. As Stephen Whitmer said in a recent interview with Christianity Today, if you're kind, invested, and involved, you can become a pastor of a community. Now, when Jesus was in that upper room with the disciples on the night when he was betrayed, he said to them, I no longer call you servants, but friends. And for Jesus, friendship was a practical and concrete way to live out love of neighbor. And I really see it as the art of neighboring. So a key verse for me is Galatians 6:10 that says, whenever we have an opportunity, let us work for the good of all, and especially for the family of faith. Now, the theological term for this is solidarity. It's not weighing people based on how useful they are to our ministry or whether they might come to our church. And this means seeing the good of the church as being bound up with the good of the whole community. And the reality is that in the rural church, we cannot thrive unless the rural community thrives. And this is a very practical thing. We will never be able to serve our community with verve and creativity if we don't love it. If we see being there as a sacrifice, then we're going to be ministering through gritted teeth, right? And that's not going to be good for anybody. So a guy named Kent Anderson, who works with an outfit called Rural Compassion that began in the Assemblies of God, he talks about becoming the best friend of the rural community. He says, become the best friend of the school. Become the best friend of the first responders, right? Pick your segment of the community and become their best friend, and I like that. And I think what this is going to mean is that you're sitting on boards, you're getting involved with the school, you're coaching youth sports, and I realize this has its limitations, right? It sounds like something that a guy who drives a minivan would say, but it's getting involved in the community. And Michael Gray from the Crosspoint Church, again, he says, one of the benefits that he have, there's sermons on a screen, right? It's recorded at the main campus. And so he only preaches like once every 6 weeks or something like that. And what that means is that Michael Gray in this little town outside of Hutchinson, Kansas, he can spend his entire week out in the community. So he's because I spend crazy amount of time on sermons. I don't know about you. But he's out there like reading to the kids in this school, and he's volunteering at the college football games, and he's doing a Bible study in the low-income housing complex, right? He's just out in the community befriending the place. I talked to a pastor who described how his town of 800 people, they used to have a movie theater. And running a movie theater in a town of 800 people is a little bit of a challenge, especially in the age of Netflix. And the movie theater went out of business. But he and others in town banded together, and they formed a nonprofit to run the movie theater. And so when I was talking to this pastor, he described how his role was to go and put up the new movie posters and to sell the tickets. He said he's also trained on the popcorn machine. And that kind of community involvement isn't going to necessarily lead to direct faith interactions, right? I mean, I guess there could be this moment where you're handing them the popcorn, you're like squirting that liquid heart attack palm oil butter and being like, Jesus loves you, right? But the reality is that most of the time, it's not going to lead directly to new disciples. But what it is a way to tend to the life of the whole community. It's befriending the community. And I think befriending the community is going to play out in a couple of different ways. The first one is that we release outcomes to God. And I really think we need to redefine how we measure growth. In his 1922 book, Rural Church Life in the Middle West, a guy named Benson Landis quotes approvingly the rural secretary of the home mission board of a large denomination. And I think you really got to read this in like a 1920s radio announcer voice, but he says this: "We know that the country church is sick, very sick, but give us enough money and the right kind of men, and we will solve the problems." Yeah, I didn't say it, but this is to fail. This is to fail to see the distinct contours and challenges of the rural church, and to make the mistake that so many have of trying to drop in a fix-it idea from the home office or the city. Because you know what? We don't have control over the outcomes. And especially in small towns where there are sometimes hidden, or at least they're hidden to pastors and leaders who come in from the outside, there can be hidden structures that prevent people from responding to our invitations. And also because success is a measure that, as writer Tim Suttle puts it, is above our pay grade. I talked to a young pastor named Daniel Wade in the town of Formoso, Kansas. And Formoso is a community of 70 people. His church is the only one in town. It's 30 people. And I said, Daniel, how do you define success in this environment? And he said, you know what? As long as there are people, there's work to do. He says, my work is an offering to God, right? The second thing I think we have to do is abide. And what that means is that we got to be willing to stick around for a little while. And I got this word abide from Jesus in John 15, right? Jesus says, abide in me as I abide in you. I am the vine, you are the branches. Those who abide in me and I in them will bear much fruit, because apart from me, you can do nothing. And abiding has this profound spiritual component of being in Christ. And then as we are in Christ, being in the community. It's the incarnation continuing through us. And you see Jesus not only teaching this principle, but when he developed leaders for the mission, Jesus lived this out, right? So he emphasized nearness over breadth. Jesus sent out his disciples to proclaim the gospels in nearby communities, and he gave instructions that they were not to move around from house to house, but were to remain with that person of peace who first welcomed them in and fed them. Abiding is one way that pastors and congregations proclaim hope in declining rural communities. To abide is to remain. But abiding is more than just staying put. It is remaining with a sense of commitment for all that God is doing in a particular place. It's seeing ourselves as called to a place providentially and intentionally by the God who loves all that he has created. Abiding is learning to love people and place, and that living that love out through steadfast commitment over time. And in one way, abiding is entirely pragmatic. It's a method for pastors and leaders to build trust in the community. And it takes time to build trust, right? I think it takes at least 5 years for the church and for the community to trust that we are solid, right? That we're not going to disappear at the first hint of trouble or opportunity. But more important, abiding is an act of love. It's believing that population size and economic wealth don't sum up the worth of a place. And when we start to take this conviction to heart about rural communities, we might try something radical, living in them. Now, one of the most basic ways that we value rural communities is by choosing to live in them. We show up and we stay put. And we might ground our presence in the theological language of incarnation and solidarity, but it all comes down to the vote of confidence that we give by living in a place. Showing up and staying put are fundamentally hopeful acts, especially in rural communities where people have been moving away. Now, abiding is going to require some profound spiritual discernment on our part. Because get this, abiding can also easily slip into what I once heard a pastor describe as an unhealthy oversettledness, right? Abiding can also become just a way to stick to what's known and comfortable to us. So we've really got to be paying attention to God. And abiding is a challenge because it really goes against the grain of our society's narrative of progress. You know, the rolling stone gathers no moss, right? So there's going to be powerful forces that will tell you that if you're really going to live up to your full potential, if you're going to really honor the massive investment of time and treasure to get that theological degree, then you need to move on, right? And probably to a bigger church in the suburbs. There will be leaders in your denomination or network who will call you up and who will want to discuss that possibility with you. And it will take some discernment to know how to abide. Brothers and sisters, God's love sends us out to the ends of the earth, and rural communities are often those ends. And we take a look around and we really learn to see and truly love the people and place that we discover there. And just like the steamboat Arabia that was heading up the Missouri, there are challenges and obstacles and river snags. Going rural means paddling upstream, after all. But remember that example of Jesus with the disciples. When they were in the boat, caught up in a tempest, Jesus came walking to them on the water, and he snuffed the storm and flattened the waves. And when that happens, Mark tells that the disciples were utterly astounded because they did not understand about the loaves. And they didn't get the connection between Jesus gathering up the loaves and Jesus stilling the storm. But friends, we know something about the meaning of the disciples in the boat and those loaves upon the hills. The disciples are the church, and so are the loaves. And the same Christ who was on mission with the disciples in the boat was the one who cared that the least fragment not be lost. And he didn't lose a disciple to the storm, and he won't give up on the least, most far-flung, tiniest crumb of those loaves. Amen. So I was told that we could have like a couple of minutes for questions, and I didn't leave much. But if you have a question or a comment or like pushback, I would totally welcome that and be open to that.
I know Michael Gray, by the way, Jonathan Faulkner. So you mentioned farmers. I'm getting ready to move to a church in a farm community. It's primarily, the church itself is not primarily farmers, but the community is a farming community. How do we, even so, address the issues of that 8%? Because there's a lot going on in the farm community right now. There's a lot affecting it, especially in the town I'm moving to. So.
Yeah. No, that's a great question. And I think it is important to, okay, so not everybody's a farmer, but either way, in many rural communities, farming is still going to be important with all these kind of subsidiary industries, right, that go with it. And so if commodity prices are low, which they are, if we're not selling soybeans to China, which we're not, then, people aren't buying the new tractor and doing all that stuff, right? They're not adding addition onto their house or something. So I think you do have to kind of have some awareness of that. I think you got to have kind of the global awareness of the big currents that are going on in the community and have an understanding of like where farm prices are at, what soybean prices are kind of doing, and just have some curiosity about that. And I think also, one of the things that's interesting is that in rural communities, even if everybody's not a farmer, there is a way that there's a kind of energy that kind of takes hold of the community. At least in Kansas, when it is, end of June, early July, and it's wheat harvest time, even if you're not a farmer at all or involved in wheat harvest, like you kind of feel that excitement of like we're bringing in the wheat, right? We're bringing in the sheaves. And so, just kind of understanding that dynamic and that energy in your community. And then I think at the individual level, sitting in tractors with farmers and riding along with them and just talking about life and, getting to know people and hear their stories. So, I don't know if it's that much different from going to any community, except that there's kind of just the obviousness of agriculture that does hold a lot of things together. So I don't know if that's helpful, but that's what I would kind of say. Yeah, okay.
Someone else have a question? Can you speak briefly to being a bivocational pastor as both a strategy and a necessity, what the challenges and the benefits?
Yeah, so being a bivocational pastor, I think that the credibility that gives you as bivocational is that you are out in the community in work clothes, right? And so people see you doing whatever it is that you do, and you have a natural opportunity to connect with people and be a part of their lives. And that is a challenge, I think, for pastors that are solely in the ministry. The challenge, of course, is that you're going to be a little bit harried sometimes, right? And so you're going to have to pick and choose what you do because you don't have the luxury of spending as much time on developing the sermon or whatever that is for you as you would if you were in full-time ministry. I think that is a reality in a lot of rural communities, the bivocational reality, and I think it's probably moving more and more in that direction, that you have people either serving multiple churches in a couple of different communities or doing it bivocationally. But, I see so many benefits to it, and maybe that's because I'm just looking at the other side of the fence and seeing that the grass is greener over there. But I see so many benefits to bivocational, just that you're in the community, that you're doing work that gives you that respect. I think sometimes the work of pastors is so poorly understood, and we do things like prayer that have no clear product. One time I was spending time in prayer, right? And this is important to me. I was spending time in prayer, and like the boiler inspector showed up at our church. And I don't know if you have boiler inspectors here, if you know anything about it. It's a little bit of a racket, but sorry if hopefully your bivocation is not as a boiler inspector, but well, the boiler inspector comes through, and I point him the way to the boiler, right? And then he comes back after 5 minutes, and he sees me praying. He's like, so, not much going on today, right? Like, well, it depends what day you come by. Come on Wednesday. There's all these kids here for this program. Dude, today I pray. And he goes, I guess prayer is something, right? So, often when it's not understood, right? What are we doing? It doesn't have a product, doesn't have something that can be tallied up. So that's the challenge. But I think there's so much opportunity with bivocational.